of the United States has the power to protect our homeland and forcibly remove foreign terrorists who pose a grave threat to families and communities.
A tariff is a tax, and Donald Trump owns these erratic taxes.
I don't like the thought of waging a trade war with the entire world. That's what we're doing right now. It's us against everybody.
We need a governor who's focused on keeping our community safe and addressing the challenges and the real concerns of people across our Commonwealth.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, is there an art of the deal when it comes to tariffs? Well, there just might be. The White House says multiple countries, the number ranges from 50 to 70, are trying to negotiate over the tariffs that President Trump announced last week. The stock market today initially responded positively to talk of potential deals. Then it most certainly didn't. An early morning rally fizzled late in the day with the Dow wiping out a 14-point initial gain, closing all three indices down. That means in the red. China is not negotiating. This is important. The world's second largest economy called President Trump's new tariffs, quote, a mistake upon a mistake, end quote. Starting tomorrow, we're all going to live in a different place because imported goods to the United States from China will be subject to a tariff of, brace yourself, 104%.
I think it was a big mistake, this Chinese escalation, because they're playing with a pair of twos. Many of our trading partners, they have queued up, and they have kept their cool. They have not escalated, and they will get priority in the queue.
I want to start tonight, as we have been so many nights in the last couple of weeks, with Kelly O'Grady in New York. Kelly, great to see you. So, again, we always remind our audience this is not a stock market show. The stock market isn't purely the U.S. economy, but the volatility does matter because it's a verdict, at least initially, on what the market is either imagining, expecting, or betting on. And this morning, the expectations were net positive. And then as the day wore on, things slid back into red.
I know. I kept having to check my phone, Major, to see if we were in the red or the green. There was a lot of back and forth on this roller coaster today. And it was really for two reasons. I mean, one, just from the investor perspective, there were a lot of good buying opportunities on the table. A lot of these stocks have lost a lot of money, and some of them are definitely going to be good ones to own in the long term. That's one thing. But more on, what does this all mean in terms of what investors were betting on when it comes to the economy is, as you put it, there was all this talk of negotiations. And as we got closer and closer to this midnight deadline and the closing bell, nothing really materialized in terms of concrete deals that might make that midnight deadline a little less painful. And so why you saw investors pull back is that anxiety and the uncertainty returned, that maybe tariffs are going to be going into place as of midnight tonight, and it is going to be as severe as we expected, and that could lead to further inflation, less consumer spending, and you've heard a lot of analysts start to talk about a potential economic slowdown.
And let's just try to quantify this if we can, Kelly, because I looked up on the USTR, U.S. Trade Representative's website. In 2024, United States imported $438.9 billion worth of goods from China. $438.9 billion. We exported $143.5. Therein lies the trade imbalance. But that's a lot of imports from China. Subjected to a 104% tariff, that is going to be noticeable almost immediately.
Well, it's going to be double, right?
Right.
In terms of a little bit more than double. So, yeah, and in fact, I have been talking to businesses that rely specifically on imports from China, big and small, and they are just simply not going to be able to absorb 104%. They're going to have to pass some of that on to the customer. Now, in terms of when that might be noticeable, it's really going to depend on industry. A lot of industries tried to stock up ahead of this. And there are going to be some companies that are bigger that are going to be able to handle this a little bit more. But Major, a lot of the small businesses are very worried that something like this could put them out of business.
Kelly O'Grady, always a pleasure. Thanks so very much. Jennifer Jacobs joins me now from the White House North Lawn. Jennifer, great to see you. We had a briefing in the White House briefing room today. You were there. How'd it go?
It went very well. The first thing I wanted to ask the press secretary was about what I have been told, and that's that the White House is discussing relaxing the tariffs on Israel. The press secretary wouldn't really confirm that, but she did say that discussions are ongoing. And whatever those discussions are, I know that the White House has been pleased because the press secretary said that Israel is the model for nations that are trying to negotiate with the president. So the message today from the White House was the tariffs are on. There isn't going to be a delay. The president met with his trade team in the Oval Office this morning, and the president directed them to do a tailor-made package for each country that is approaching the United States to try to get some wiggle room in its tariffs. So Jameson Greer, the U.S. trade representative, is the lead person on that. So they're trying to get the best deal possible for U.S. workers and for companies, domestic companies, that they can. So they're already starting to put together these packages. And the president just now told us that he was even musing about having some of those law firms that made deals with him to escape those punitive EOs, those punitive measures that volunteered to offer some pro bono law services, that he would bring them in to help negotiate some of these deals. He said Japan and Korea are flying in to talk to him. We know that the leader of Italy is coming in next week. And of course, we had Israel yesterday. So a lot of these nations are coming in to make deals. And the big message at the White House today was, yes, we're open for negotiating.
Jennifer, another topic was this public spat between Elon Musk and a trade voice within the Trump White House, Peter Navarro. Elon Musk calling Peter Navarro truly a moron. Peter Navarro saying that Elon Musk's Tesla auto company is really not a manufacturer, it's more of an assembler. And the only reason I bring this up is because Peter Navarro has been out front saying it's not just about tariffs, it's about non-tariff barriers, suggesting that any of these negotiations will be much, much more difficult than just a simple tariff conversation. So I guess I want to put before you, if I could, two questions. How important or unimportant does the White House think this public spat is? And does it in any way indicate that Peter Navarro's influence on the future of these negotiations might be waning?
I'll answer your second question first. I don't think his influence is waning. But what I can tell you, Major, is that there's a lot of tension around the president, and a lot of people have been trying to get in the president's face to explain their view on the tariffs and why they think they're either a good thing or not a good thing. So there's two camps about permanent or not permanent. So I can tell you, we were down in Florida with the president covering him this weekend, and my sources down there said that Mar-a-Lago was just rife with people trying to get his attention. Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, was down there, flew down with the president. I know there's been some tension from some Trump advisors about the message that the Commerce Secretary has been delivering, saying it would be, quote unquote, worth it if there were a recession because the tariffs are a good thing, et cetera. I know from one of my sources that the president had dinner on the patio at Mar-a-Lago on Saturday night, and the Commerce Secretary wasn't one of those invited guests for dinner. It was the Secretary of State and the president's personnel director, Sergio Gore, as well as one of the deputy chief of staff, James Blair, and actually Fox News' Judge Jeanine was one of the guests. And it's just interesting, Major, how there's a rope line around the president when he eats down there, and the Secret Service tries to keep everyone back. But there's a lot of people trying to catch his eye, trying to get a moment with him, trying to express to him why the tariffs are hurting their companies, or just a lot of people who are very, very, very passionate about this. So the tension is real. The spat between Elon Musk and Peter Navarro is real. Their disdain for each other we've known it for a little while. Now it's become public. The press secretary explained it today as, listen, we're the most transparent administration in history. Our officials even have their fights in front of you, and boys will be boys, and we'll let them keep on sparring.
Jennifer Jacobs, very well sourced, as always. Thank you so very much. I appreciate it. The Trump administration and lawyers for a Maryland man wrongfully deported to El Salvador filed Supreme Court briefs in a fight over whether or not he shall be returned to the United States. This comes as the court gives a go-ahead for the deportation of suspected gang members under a 1798 law known as the Enemy Aliens Act. Our Scott McFarland joins me now right here at the desk with the latest. So what is the latest, Scott?
Well, they have opened the door to this use of a law that hasn't been invoked since Japanese internment in World War II, but they put a big caveat in there.
The Supreme Court did.
Sure did. The Supreme Court has determined through its order that you have to have some form of due process if you're going to be deported through the Alien Enemies Act. It's far from clear what due process is going to include and not include, and you better believe this is going to go back through the courts to articulate that issue. But they put a safeguard in there, presumably to prevent the types of mistakes that hit on March 15th, when this use of the Alien Enemies Act was brought back for the first time since the 1940s, and somebody, at least one person, was deported by mistake. But this is going to go back to the courts. The Supreme Court actually determined as part of their order that one of the issues here is this is the wrong venue. This case was brought initially in Washington, D.C., and it should have been brought in Texas, where the men were initially held. So this will be filed, presumably, in the coming days, if not hours, in Texas.
Right. So venue is one matter. It's an important matter, but it's not the substance of it. And I want to play for you, Scott, something the Attorney General Pam Bondi said at the White House today about this underlying case and the substance of it. Let's listen.
It was an administrative error as to why he was deported, and he is a known gang member. ICE testified he was a gang member, and we believe he should stay where he is.
The he involved is a human being, and a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple of days ago, the Vice President of the United States on social media said he was a convicted gang member. No evidence of that. Now, he's a known gang member. What do we know and what is knowable about his affiliations, real or imagined, with gangs?
We know unequivocally his family has denied he had any connections to gangs, foreign or domestic. But we also know what the plaintiffs have been arguing continuously through the course of this month over this deportation to begin with. This is exactly why you want to have a court hearing before you deport somebody, so you can litigate that and argue that either way before the deportation is effected. That's the more fundamental issue. But in this case, in the case of Mr. Garcia of Maryland, there's a different thing at play. It could come out when the Supreme Court decides what to do about his case. Can you get somebody back after you've deported them to another country? That's the issue the Supreme Court will have to deal with as well.
Scott McFarland, thank you so much, sir. I appreciate it. Next, Democratic Congressman and House Intelligence Committee member Jason Crow, his take on the president's tariffs, that now very famous Signal group chat about things in Yemen, and the future state of the Democratic Party. All of that next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Sources tell CBS News National Security Advisor Mike Waltz meant to add a spokesman, not a journalist, to that now immortalized chat among national security officials within the Trump administration on that unsecured commercial app known as Signal. Now, that's a straight-up mistake. And it's a mistake our next guest, Colorado Democratic Congressman Jason Crow, said put the lives of U.S. military personnel, quote, at stake. Congressman, good to have you with us. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is, I'm a combat veteran. I served 3 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. Part of that was as an Army Ranger in Special Operations, and we are asking our men and women in uniform to do incredibly dangerous stuff every single day. As we're sitting here having this conversation, there are thousands of service members around the world protecting us, preventing terrorist attacks, very dangerous stuff. And our adversaries, folks like Russia and China, are actively trying to get information about these operations, locations of our troops, so they can hold them at risk or even outright attack them. And by putting information about these missions on an unsecured channel, directly put those men and women at risk.
And if someone in your position, back when you served, had done this, you'd have been prosecuted, right?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I learned day one in boot camp that the foundation of military leadership is leadership by example, right? Whether you're a private, a sergeant, a captain, or a general, the foundation of that is you're supposed to set the example yourself. Unfortunately, in the Trump administration, the example is the opposite. The message they have been sending loud and clear is that you can do anything you want. You're immune from accountability. It doesn't matter. Well, think about the message that sends to our men and women who are putting their lives on the line every day. That, their bosses, their commanders, it doesn't matter. They can do whatever they want, and they are judged by a different standard. It's just an awful example.
Mike Waltz, you served with him in the House. Are you disappointed, surprised?
Yeah, I'm disappointed. I think the real the real issue that troubles me is actually Pete Hegseth, Secretary Hegseth. He's the one who put the classified information, the operational information on there. And he's the only one on that chain who had direct command authority over our 2 million servicemen and women, who's trying to make decisions. And it's exactly why, like I said, time and time again, it's exactly why you don't put somebody with no experience running large national security organizations in charge of our largest department and our most consequential one, in my view, one that makes life and death decisions multiple times a day. Experience does matter, it turns out.
Congressman, I talked about the tariff conversation. At the White House today, Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, quoted Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi from years back, but saying back then, back in the day, both brought to attention trade imbalances with China and said American leadership must do something about it. Caroline Leavitt said President Trump finally is, and Democrats who now criticize him for that are hypocrites.
Well, there's a key distinction here. Most people believe that tariffs can be an important tool when they are used surgically, right? There are trade imbalances, there are unfair trade practices, no doubt about that. And there's bipartisan support around correcting those. But tariffs should be used strategically and surgically. What this administration has done is a broad-based, across-the-board tariff without regard to whether they're our partner, without regard to whether they're an ally, in many cases, whether an island isn't even habited by human beings or not. And that is very dangerous, and that's going to cause a lot of pain for a lot of businesses, a lot of my constituents in Colorado, right? And there's a very, very troubling thing that the administration keeps on saying. They say, oh, this is going to be short-term pain, short-term pain. Well, I grew up in a working-class community. Most of the people that I was raised with worked paycheck to paycheck, right? And these folks oftentimes don't know, where is their rent money coming from at the end of the month? Where is their mortgage coming from? Are they going to be able to afford to put food on the table for their children? So what we learned is when people at the top are talking about short-term pain, they're not talking about their short-term pain. They're talking about everyone else's short-term pain. This is devastating stuff.
Congressman, the New York Times has written about you in a way that says you know how to speak paycheck to paycheck in ways it's suggested many coastal, more liberal Democrats do not. A, do you accept that premise? And B, are you, as the New York Times suggested, the future face of the Democratic Party?
Well, I don't compare myself to others. That's the amazing thing about the Democratic Party is we are a big tent party. We're not lockstep. There's no ideological litmus test. We're not all the same. That's one of the reasons why I'm proud to be a Democrat. But yeah, I come from a different background. I worked Arby's and McDonald's to put my way through high school, help support my family. I worked in construction to pay my way through college. I eventually went into the military. So my focus since day one of being in Congress is how can I help working class Americans, blue collar Americans, the type of folks who take showers at the end of the day as opposed to take showers at the beginning of the day. They often get overlooked. There are vast swaths of America who don't believe the system is working for them, and they're right. The system is not working for them. But that's why I'm a Democrat, to prevent the system from being rigged, and I'm very proud to do that work.
And very quickly, what you just said, how does it fit within the coming debate over the Republican budget resolution and tax bill?
Well, it's pretty clear this resolution is just unbelievably devastating for working folks. Well, what it does is it gives a huge tax break to the top 1%, to billionaires, to corporate CEOs. It balloons the budget deficit, and it does so on the back of working folks. It's just terrible. It's the type of stuff that people hate about Washington, the type of stuff that I hate about Washington. And of course, I will fight it because it's bad for the people that I represent.
Congressman Jason Crow, Democrat, Colorado. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Next, the latest firing in the administration, that is to say the Trump administration's purge, and it's pretty fair to say that. It's been so many of them, high-ranking military officials. Why a senior female officer attached to NATO was relieved of her duties. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has fired another top-ranking military official. Vice Admiral Shoshana Chatfield was assigned to NATO. She joins several other high-ranking female military officers to be fired by this administration. CBS News senior national security correspondent Charlie Daggett joins me now. Charlie, who is she? Why does this matter? And what's the broader context?
Oh, Major, the official line from Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell this morning is that she was dismissed due to a loss of confidence in her ability to lead, which is sort of Pentagon speak for just because. So there was no further comment. She was the top U.S. official on, not just female official, U.S. official on NATO's military committee. She had been singled out. She's put on a sort of woke list that has been put together by a conservative group because of comments she's made in the past promoting diversity, which, of course, Defense Secretary Hegseth has said repeatedly that diversity, or at least the sort of pursuit of diversity, weakens the forces. So she was the only woman on a panel of 32 representatives on that NATO committee, and again, the highest-ranking, not just female, highest-ranking U.S. official there.
But very quickly, Charlie, no sense that she did anything wrong, prosecutable, unethical, just, like you said, under the broad category of loss of confidence.
Nothing at all. There is no explanation whatsoever. She's got decades of experience. She's got combat experience. She's the 9th senior officer, the 3rd high-ranking female officer to be removed. That includes the head of the Navy, the head of the Coast Guard. Again, in either of those examples, people who've had decades of experience in those positions, no explanation given for the reason for their dismissal.
Charlie Daggett at the Pentagon. Thanks so very much. President Trump has given his full support to the Senate-approved Republican budget resolution. That's one part of the story. But here's the other part. Does the legislation have enough support to pass in the Republican-controlled House? We'll dig into that right here next on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Thanks for staying with us. So we talked about this before we went to break. Several House Republicans are holdouts. They're not yet sold on the budget resolution that might come to the floor as early as this week. So they went to the White House today to talk to the chief spokesperson for the party and the chief salesman for the agenda. Who is that? That would be President Trump. Nicole Killian is on Capitol Hill to tell us about that meeting. And, of course, House Speaker Mike Johnson, day in and day out, is nothing if not chipper. He came back from the White House meeting chipper. Tell us why.
Well, he, too, has to sell the deal, right? So he can't paint a pessimistic view if he wants to get this thing passed this week, which is what he wants to do. And he continues to insist that he believes this budget resolution will clear before week's end, although I would note that as of yet, nothing has been scheduled in the House Rules Committee. Of course, any piece of legislation before it hits the floor has to go through the Rules Committee first. And so that is not happening. Now, we do know President Trump is set to address the NRCC later tonight at a campaign-related dinner, so we certainly expect a lot of House Republicans in the room. Whether or not those conversations will continue there remains to be seen, but certainly the Speaker hoping that he can twist a few more arms to get this budget resolution clear. And just to be clear, Major, this is just to set the guidelines and the process for moving forward with this budget resolution. It's not the actual legislation itself, but it is a key hurdle that has to be cleared for Republicans to move forward with the president's agenda.
And, Nicole, what's the tenor of the conversation about tariffs up there?
Well, obviously, we had the U.S. Trade Representative here on Capitol Hill earlier today testifying before the Senate Finance Committee. Tomorrow he'll appear before House Ways and Means. But he continued to defend the president's proposal here, saying that the U.S. trade deficit is over $1 trillion, that this is something that has been decades in the making and needs to be rectified. And yes, there may be some pain that comes with this process. At the same time, he tried to urge patience by saying that he has been in conversation with a number of his counterparts in other countries, that many dozens of nations have reached out, over 50, to his office to try to engage in negotiations. We have also heard that number is upwards of 70 different countries. But that being said, he did say that he was going to kind of take a country-by-country approach in how these negotiations may go. He did not give any timetable for how long this may be worked out. And when I asked him specifically why there aren't any exemptions with respect to this tariff policy, which is something that many senators pressed him on, he said that, the president didn't want any exemptions. They don't want to take a Swiss cheese approach to what he believes is a universal problem.
With all the details, as always, from Capitol Hill, Nicole Killian, thanks so very much. I want to bring in our political panel. Michael LaRosa served as First Lady Jill Biden's press secretary. Lance Trover was a spokesperson for Doug Burgum's 2024 presidential campaign. Doug Burgum, now the Interior Secretary. So, Lance, what's the deal on the fresh-baked cookies? Look it up, kids. Look it up. You won't be disappointed.
As I said before, if fresh-baked cookies are wrong, I don't want to be right.
That's good. That's a nice soundbite to get you through that. I want to play for you sound from today on Capitol Hill. Senator Thom Tillis, Republican of North Carolina, sometimes on the Trump train, sometimes not, talking about his overall anxieties about this tariff issue. Let's listen.
I'm getting my head around the a la prima approach. I'm not condemning it because I'm not a trade expert, but I still, at some point, and I understand that you are the trade rep. So if you own this decision, then I'll look to you to figure out if we're going to be successful. If you don't own the decision, I'm just trying to figure out whose throat I get to choke if it's wrong, and who I put up on a platform and thank them for the novel approach that was successful if they're right.
Whose throat I get to choke if it's wrong.
Speaking of looking for sound bites.
Let's take it away.
I was at a meeting on the Hill today where there were several House Republicans, and a lot of discussion was going on. And I actually didn't hear the tariff discussion. It didn't raise its head too much. More people were talking about the budget vote that's potentially coming forward.
Because that's coming up in the next few days.
That was really top of mind. But I found it interesting that
that's their burden.
But then I found it interesting that the tariff wasn't really top of mind. Here's why I'm thinking of this, though, is because many of these Republican members represent blue-collar districts that have seen their towns decimated, factories leaving, wages gone, jobs going overseas. So that's where a lot of these House Republicans are. And so I think, the budget and getting the tax cut package passed is going to be priority number one.
But Lance, let me just answer you that, because it's a very important point, because their perspective is grounded in an understanding that some of their constituents have. But what their constituents, and I really wonder if they're hearing this, when Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, says the jobs that are going to be created are robot jobs in factories that are going to need HVAC engineers to keep the robots cool. I'm not making that up. That's what he said. Do you think those constituents in those districts that have seen some deindustrialization are expecting robot workers and HVAC technicians?
Well, I think we've already we've already seen prior to this what's gone on with the tariffs, a reinvestment by major companies in this country. I think we will continue to see that. We now have 70 countries, according to the White House, coming to the table saying, hey, but here's the reason why. We have a strong economy. Gas prices are down. We saw the jobs numbers last week. We have a strong economy. We can bear the brunt of some of this. Some of these other countries, China in particular, who wants to play fast and loose here, I'm not sure that they really can in the long run.
Michael, you've been biding your time.
Yeah,
Jump in.
So here's the problem. Unlocking reconciliation through the budget resolution to get us to tax reform and cutting the budget, it's all going to be negated by tariff policy. It's exactly what happened under Trump 1.0. He did tax cuts and he did the budget. And guess what happened? Employment slumped in the manufacturing industry. The trade deficit rose, and this was all prior to COVID. And the economic gains he made, the economic growth gains he made up until 2018, all slumped because of the tariff policy. We've seen it under McKinley, who created a trade war in the early 1900s. We saw Hoover double down on it, which led to the Great Depression. And they both created political realignments. This has been an economic loser for the country for a very long time, but it's even a bigger political loser for Republicans. And Democrats are fine for them to walk the plank. But I'm guessing the animated Mr. Tillis from North Carolina would be happy to sign on to my old boss, Maria Cantwell's bill, which would rein back, could wrestle control back of tariff policy.
Put it back in Congress's hands instead of a president.
But I'm guessing we won't see that go to the floor of the Senate or the House.
Well, the Senate passed a non-binding resolution on that last week,
right?
With a few Republican defections. Here's what I also want to ask you, because the Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, went to great pains today to quote Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi from years back, decrying the budget imbalance, the trade imbalance rather, not budget, but trade imbalance with China, and saying anyone who's a Democrat now who criticizes the president is a hypocrite, because back then, back in the day, Democrats cared about this issue.
Sure, I'm sure they did, but they probably are hypocrites, I would say. I mean, right? That's what happens when you...
You heard it, ladies and gentlemen. I don't need to re-rack that. He just said it. Democrats are hypocrites, some of them.
I mean, look, I'm a new Democrat. I come from the wing of the Democratic Party that it supports free trade, the Bill Clinton Democratic wing of the party. Tariffs have not been a successful economic tool, no matter when in history we have used them. So, look, I know that there are splits. There was a split in the Democratic Party when President Obama tried to pass trade protection assistance in 2016. It was a major split. And it was one of the few things that President Obama and Paul Ryan worked on together to get done.
Michael LaRosa, Lance Trover, I appreciate it both very much. China is vowing to fight President Trump's new tariffs. We'll look at just exactly, well, maybe not exactly, but we're going to try to get to exactly how this escalating trade war between the two biggest economies in the world could impact you and the rest of us in the global economy. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back. As we mentioned earlier in the show, the Dow, NASDAQ, and S&P all closed down the day negative, even though they roared out of the morning with big gains. This volatility is, at least in part, a kind of verdict on President Trump's tariff regime. I want to bring back in Martin Backerdax. He is the senior editor and chief markets correspondent for the financial news site The Street. Great to have you on, Martin. I want to play for you some sound from the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer about this approach, and I want you to evaluate it on the other side. Let's listen.
As the countries come to approach us, what we've told them is if you have a better idea to achieve reciprocity and to get our trade deficit down, we want to talk to you. We want to negotiate with you. And it goes both ways.
So, if you have a new idea, we want to negotiate. But what does that mean to you? How do you read that, Martin?
To be honest with you, I think it starts from a flawed premise. It assumes that all trade deficits are a bad thing for the economy that runs them, and I just don't accept that. The United States has been the runaway economic success for the past 50 years, and certainly since the COVID pandemic. And the fact that trade deficits have been a part of that, I don't think is a coincidence. You get, as a result, as an American consumer, cheaper goods. At the same time, you also get billions, in some cases trillions, of capital inflows because the money that Americans spend on those goods is recycled back into the economy. That drives stock prices up, it drives treasury bond yields down, it keeps our mortgages lower, it keeps our interest rates lower, and it ticks over the economy as a result. So I think the premise is flawed, and therefore I'm not sure you're going to get fresh ideas that are going to satisfy lawmakers who have been pressing this issue from a political point of view rather than an economic one.
And Martin, there's an interesting dialogue going on from the White House, and it runs something like this. And it's not the headline thing they say, but it's implied in what they say. The U.S. economy is really strong now, and it can withstand a little bit of turbulence better than other competitive free market economies, meaning they're going to have to bend to our will. And one of the things that I find interesting about that subtle line of argument is that's not what this administration, when it was running for the White House, was saying about the U.S. economy before the election. They were saying it was in terrible shape. Now they're saying it's so resilient and strong, it puts the United States in a uniquely powerful position. Evaluate both sides of that.
No, it's a great point, actually, and that's the practicality of politics, isn't it? You tend to campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose. And I think right now we're talking about the prose with respect to the Republican Party, speaking of the resilience of the U.S. economy. I think to some degree there's some truth to that because it is a consumer-led one, and the consumer remains relatively healthy, particularly when it comes to the labor market, because we have very low unemployment. And thus far, we haven't seen the stresses in that would indicate a slowdown in consumption. Now, the flip side is, can that American consumer withstand or perhaps sort of wait out the trade war that we anticipate is coming not only tomorrow, but in the months ahead? And quite honestly, I just don't know that we have the answer to that question. I harken back to an issue back in about 2017 or 2018 when there was a passenger who was dragged off a flight because it was overbooked. It was quite a sensational story, and he made quite a ruckus as a result. He was unwilling to accept $1,000 in compensation for a flight that he paid $200 for, because as an American consumer, he wanted what he wanted. I'm not being critical of that, but I am saying that's probably a reflection of consumer sentiment now, and that does make me question whether the American consumer has that resilience to ride this out.
Which goes to this underlying great unknown. Can the United States essentially break the will of its trading partners, starting with China?
That will be difficult. I think to some degree, China has really decided to hunker down and try to win this on a long-term basis. But in order to do that, I think China's going to have to do one thing that it's been very reluctant to do, and that is stoke domestic purchasing. In other words, stoke their domestic consumer. I think the assumption has been, from a political lens, that if you get Chinese consumers purchasing domestic goods and exercising that kind of consumer freedom, political freedom is not going to be far behind. And I don't know that that's something the Chinese Communist Party can abide just now. So they have been reluctant to do that. Now, if they can probably ride that out. But if not, and they ride it out on the strength of only their export and manufacturing, then they're probably playing a weaker hand than the one they have now.
Excellent stuff. Martin Bakardax, I appreciate it very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Virginia will elect its first female governor in the state's history this November. Next, I'll ask the Democratic candidate, Abigail Spanberger, about this historic race between her and the Commonwealth's Republican lieutenant governor. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Voters of Virginia are 7 months away from electing their next governor, but fundraising in this election already shattering records. Let me describe how. Virginia Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears is the Republican nominee. Her campaign says it has raised more than $3.1 million in the first 3 months of 2025. That's more than any Republican gubernatorial candidate in Commonwealth history for that reporting period. The Democratic candidate, Abigail Spanberger's campaign, raked in $6.7 million in that same time frame. That's the highest amount ever raised by a statewide Virginia candidate in the first quarter of an election year. Abigail Spanberger joins me now. She formerly served as Congresswoman for Virginia's 7th Congressional District from 2019 to 2025. So I want to ask you a couple of questions about where the race is, what these fundraising numbers tell you, and how important or non-important it is that whatever the outcome, the Commonwealth is going to have its first female governor.
Well, it's an exciting time here in the Commonwealth. Certainly our race is heating up. It's an exciting time because voters across Virginia know the stakes of this election. Voters across Virginia know that the choice is a clear one between a governor who will stand up for Virginians and Virginia's economy, particularly under these unprecedented attacks on the federal workforce. 320,000 Virginians are federal employees. Our larger economy, certainly the impacts of those firings ripple across communities across our Commonwealth. And with the impacts of tariffs, increased antagonistic trade wars, all of this impacts Virginia. And the stakes of this election reflect that. But importantly, Virginians also want a governor who's focused on the things that matter most to them, kind of even apart from and aside from this time of chaos. That includes putting us on path towards having the best public schools in the whole country. That means facing the reality that costs are such a challenge for families, and we have to address the housing crisis by increasing demand. We have to work to lower the cost, certainly in the grocery store where possible, but importantly in the healthcare space. And we need a governor who's focused on keeping our community safe and addressing the challenges and the real concerns of people across our Commonwealth. Those are the stakes of this election. That's why so many Virginians are engaging so aggressively with volunteerism, with support to our campaign. And that's why I know we're going to win in November 2025.
So your opponent, Republican Winsome Earl Sears, went on social media this weekend after securing the GOP nomination and say electing you would be like electing an arsonist to put out a fire, accusing you of wrongly voting for President Biden's agenda on COVID relief, the infrastructure bill, Build Back Better, accusing you of contributing to inflation in the Commonwealth. How do you respond?
I think it's a particularly ridiculous assertion, given that my opponent has been eager to claim credit for some of the funding that certainly came through from those federal dollars to Virginia's Commonwealth under our current governor's administration. But the reality is that my opponent is endeavoring to distract because she's not talking about the fact that we have seen an absolute tanking of the stock market because of Donald Trump's actions. She's not talking about the fact that the University of Virginia stated that we should anticipate a reduction in $6 billion in economic output here in the Commonwealth of Virginia if we see 10% of our federal workforce potentially lose their jobs. She doesn't want to talk about the fact that farmers and producers across Virginia who have historically sold what they raise to Canada are terrified and worried about what's coming. She doesn't want to talk about the fact that a Virginian who needs to go buy a car, used or new, may no longer be able to afford that expense. She doesn't want to talk about the fact that currently our recovery rates in math for Virginia students post-COVID are 51st after every single state and the District of Columbia. And she doesn't want to talk about the things that they haven't done. So I'll put my record of getting things done for Virginians, getting legislation passed, including bills signed into law by President Trump in his first term and bills signed into law by President Biden. And I'm proud of the work that I have done of bills that were responsive not only to the moment, but to the needs of Virginians. That's the record that I am running on. That's the record of effectiveness I want to bring to the Commonwealth as governor. And that's how I'm campaigning to make sure that people know what I have done for them as a federal legislator and what I will do as governor.
I want to ask you about something the Trump Department of Justice announced last night. It repealed a Biden-era gun policy that revoked licenses from federally licensed gun dealers if they intentionally sold weapons without running background checks or falsified records. How do you react to that?
It's outrageous. Let me just make sure your viewers heard what you said, right? If someone falsified records, so lying on federal forms, or if they didn't, a federally licensed point of sale, if they didn't do what is legally required of them, which is to run a background check, that those individuals, that those gun shops would still be able to continue operating. It's outrageous. The Trump administration is saying that if you want to break the law as a purveyor of firearms, that is totally okay. And here's a place where responsible gun owners and frankly responsible gun shop owners should be screaming from the rafters, because this is just setting us up for potential challenges, potential issues, potential danger. We know that the vast majority, frankly, of those federally licensed gun shops abide the law, are careful, recognizing that the tools they are selling can do great damage in the wrong hands, and want themselves to be able to run those background checks, to know that they're not selling a gun to a potential terrorist or someone with a long history of domestic violence, someone who will do harm to themselves, potentially if they're in point of crisis, to a law enforcement officer who's responding to a 911 call, or importantly, to their domestic partner. As so frequently we have seen is the case when folks who are not supposed to have access to firearms, those are frequently their victims. So the idea that the Trump administration would make this choice, it makes our communities less safe. It makes our law enforcement less safe, because when a prohibited buyer, someone who is legally prohibited from being able to obtain and purchase a firearm, is able to get one, that puts the police officer, the state police officer, the sheriff's deputy, whoever is responding to a potential call, that puts them in danger when someone who is a prohibited buyer is able to buy a firearm. It is just outrageous.
Abigail Spanberger, Democratic nominee for governor of Virginia, thank you very much. That does it for today. I'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.